Hey guys, tonight we step straight into a hall lit by torches, where shadows flicker across painted stone walls and gold-embroidered banners sway in the draft. You probably imagine yourself walking carefully, trying not to trip in front of a duke or duchess, because surely medieval nobles are the picture of grace and dignity, right? Wrong. If you had actually been here, you'd probably slip on a puddle of spilled wine before you even reached the long oak table. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been told that noble parties were solemn, ceremonial events. Picture rows of stiff-backed lords in shining robes, sipping soup like they're starring in a medieval etiquette commercial. It's the mental image school textbooks practically engrave into you. Kings nodding with dignity, queens whispering politely, courtiers standing at attention. The kind of gathering where the biggest scandal might be someone sneezing too loudly, but the flip, medieval upper-class parties were anything but quiet. They were noisy, chaotic, and occasionally downright ridiculous. Imagine the world's rowdiest wedding reception crossed with a sports stadium crowd. Instead of polite sips of broth, people were guzzling wine out of cups the size of soup bowls. Instead of silent reverence, they were shouting jokes, singing bawdy songs, and sometimes hurling food across the table. Dignity wasn't on the menu. Entertainment was. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, chroniclers from England to France describe banquet halls shaking with noise, laughter, clanging cups, pounding drums, even animals brought inside for spectacle. Banquets were stages, not libraries. Quirky tidbit. 1. Chronicler in Burgundy mentions trained dwarfs being sent running across the tables, carrying flaming torches, just for laughs. Try picturing that happening at a modern black tie gala. Ladies and gentlemen, dessert will be served right after the fire relay on your linen tablecloth, and scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether some of these tales are exaggerated. Moral lessons, monks complaining about noble excessor, whether nobles truly lost their minds in dining halls. Either way, the evidence suggests a party vibe that would put Vegas nightclubs to shame. It makes sense, though. For many nobles, these feasts were rare chances to display power and generosity. If you're a duke who's trying to show you're richer, cooler, and more king-adjacent than your rivals, you don't throw a quiet dinner. You throw the kind of bash that people are still gossiping about 3 towns over. Dignity might impress God, but noise impresses neighbors. Here's where it gets funny. You know that moment at family dinners when your uncle insists on telling the same bad joke about mashed potatoes every year. Medieval parties had the same vibe, except instead of mashed potatoes, it might be someone yelling about how the roast swan looks better than the bishop's hat. One poet even mocked guests for wearing their napkins like hats, trying to out-silly each other. Imagine TikTok trends, but with more feathers and less Wi-Fi. Of course, not everyone enjoyed the chaos. Some nobles, especially the older ones, frowned at the wildness, muttering that things were more dignified in my youth. Spoiler, they weren't. You can almost hear them now, shaking their heads like medieval grandparents at a rave. But here's the punchline. The myth of solemn nobility crumbles the moment you realize that your average medieval feast was closer to a college house party than a church service. The wine flowed, the jokes flew, and dignity often slipped right under the table, sometimes literally, if you drank too much. So the next time you picture a duke looking refined, just remember, he probably once lost a shoe trying to dance on the banquet bench. You've probably heard the story that medieval banquets only served fancy food, silvery platters of roast swan, crystal bowls of sugared fruit, and maybe a golden goblet filled with unicorn tears for dessert. The myth paints the menu like a luxury buffet straight out of a fairy tale, where every bite is perfection and nothing strange ever touches the table. It's a comforting image, especially if you like to believe the rich have always eaten better than the rest of us. But flip that silver lid, and things get weird. Yes, nobles ate swan, peacock, and venison, but they also experimented with food that would make even a fearless foodie hesitate. Imagine a dish dyed entirely blue, or a pie that when cut open releases live birds fluttering into the hall. It wasn't just dinner. It was medieval performance art, part cuisine, part circus, proof-tang, mainstream fact. Medieval banquets loved spectacle, and cooks worked hard to amaze guests. Chroniclers describe entire castles made of sugar, meat pies sculpted into animals, and fish dishes molded to look like dragons. Quirky tidbit. One account from 15th century France describes a roast boar dressed up in knight's armor, paraded into the hall like a warrior before being carved up for dinner. Nothing says bon appetit like slicing into Sir Porcelot, and scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether some of these extravagant recipes were actually served to guests, or whether they were mostly show food meant for display but not really eaten. After all, a blue-dyed chicken might impress your neighbor, but it doesn't exactly scream delicious. So here's the reality. Medieval banquets weren't just about feeding bellies, they were about feeding gossip. The food had to be memorable, shocking, and Instagram-worthy. If Instagram had existed, instead of snapping a photo of your latte art, you'd be bragging, "Last night I saw a peacock redressed in its own feathers, looking majestic right before we carved it." And yes, sometimes the taste suffered. Medieval cooks loved heavy spice only because pepper and cinnamon signaled wealth, but because they helped mask questionable meat. A feast in winter might mean your venison was, let's say, slightly optimistic in its freshness. Spices were medieval Febreze. Here's where the jokes sneak in. First, imagine inviting friends over, serving them a pie, and when they cut it, bam, a flock of pigeons flies straight into their faces. Second, picture explaining to your doctor that your indigestion came from eating a knight in shining bacon. Third, the thought of nobles delicately nibbling a neon blue chicken feels less Game of Thrones and more failed science experiment. Yet, despite all this, the image of constant refined dining sticks in our heads. Why? Because the surviving illustrations usually show the best bits, the polished dishes, the smiling nobles, the polished tables. They didn't sketch the guy sneezing into the gravy boat. The punchline is simple. Medieval banquets didn't serve perfect Michelin star meals every night. They served a bizarre mix of delicious roasts, questionable experiments, and theatrical stunts. Nobles wanted their parties remembered, even if it meant someone choked on a pie-bird surprise. So the next time you watch a cooking show and think, it's over the top, remember Gordon Ramsay never roasted a peacock and glued its feathers back on. And keep this in mind, we're heading straight into how people actually ate these creations. Spoiler, no forks, just fingers and courage. You probably picture medieval nobles sitting at long tables, daintily nibbling food with little golden forks, quietly dabbing their lips with silk napkins, and nodding politely, like they're in some historical etiquette manual. That's the myth, that upper-class dining was polished, refined, and polite. But flip the scene, and what you actually get is, well, a bit greasier. Forget forks. For most of the medieval period, forks weren't even a thing at European banquets. People ate with their hands, sometimes with knives, and very often with their sleeves. Imagine a room full of lords and ladies, all dressed in brocade and fur, diving into roast meat, bare-handed, like kids at a pizza party that got way out of control. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, most nobles used thick slabs of stale bread, called trenchers, as plates. You'd pile your meat and sauce onto this edible dish, and once it got soggy enough, you either ate it or gave it to the servants and poor folk waiting outside. Think of it as the world's messiest paper plate, only less recyclable. Quirky tidbit. There are records of people literally wiping their greasy fingers on the tablecloth or, worse, on the person sitting next to them if they were close friends. Forget pass the salt. This was lend me your sleeve. Somewhere in that chaos, your best velvet tunic didn't stand a chance. And the scholarly debate, historians still argue about how common hand-washing actually was during meals. Some sources suggest elaborate hand-washing rituals before and after banquets, while others imply people were far too busy wrestling with their meat to care. Were nobles truly cleaner than we give them credit for, or were their feasts just medieval buffets with no napkins in sight? The jury's still out. Now imagine the sounds of the hall, chewing, slurping, gnawing on bones, dogs barking at scraps on the floor, and someone laughing too loudly with a mouth full of swan. Doesn't sound like that graceful dining scene you've been sold, does it? If TikTok had existed, the medieval hashtag would have been #GreasyFeast. Joke number 1. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we laughed about earlier? At least no one tried smearing gravy on their face for beauty. Joke number 2. Picture the shock of a modern Findening critic teleporting into a banquet, sir. The presentation is sloppy, and your sleeve is literally soaked in goose fat. Joke number 3. Nobles had fancy goblets for wine, but the food situation closer to medieval finger food than five-star cuisine. But there was a method to the madness. Eating with your hands wasn't seen as barbaric, it was normal. In fact, good manners meant you were supposed to tear small, neat bites, not rip into food like a hungry wolf. And using your trencher showed generosity, since it could be shared later with the less fortunate. Messy, yes, but meaningful. Here's the punchline. The idea that medieval nobles dined like royalty in fairy tales crumbles once you picture them leaning across the table, grabbing a hunk of meat and wiping their hands on bread. Think less Downton Abbey, more barbecue cookout without napkins. Dignity often went the way of the gravy spilled right down the front of someone's velvet robe. And remember this image, because in the next section we'll see how this already messy chaos collided with the seating rules of the banquet. Spoiler: it turned dinner into something closer to a sports arena than a quiet meal. The myth says everyone at a medieval banquet sat quietly, respecting rank like disciplined schoolchildren. You might picture rows of nobles sitting straight-backed, whispering only when necessary, and never daring to speak out of turn while the king raised his goblet. In your head, it's practically a royal classroom, with silence broken only by the occasional polite cough. But flip that tidy fantasy, and the truth sounds more like a stadium crowd than a silent hall. Banquet seating was structured. Yes, your place at the table told the world how important you were, but the vibe was loud, competitive, and sometimes rowdy enough to rattle the rafters. It wasn't reverence, it was rivalry on display. Proof: time. Mainstream fact. First, nobles were seated according to rank, with the highest at the high table and lesser lords at lower benches stretching down the hall. Your spot was your social resume. Everyone knew who was in favor, who was out, and who had been bumped closer to the salt cellar, that little marker of mid-table mediocrity. Quirky tidbit: there are accounts of guests jockeying for seats, even sneaking into higher spots when stewards weren't paying attention. Imagine showing up to a wedding and plopping down at the bride and groom's table just to see what happens. In some banquets, it did. And sometimes the steward had to drag the seat thief back down the line, and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how strictly enforced seating was. Some records paint it as rigidly controlled, with stewards making sure every rank was observed. Others suggest it was more fluid, people shuffling around, grabbing better seats, and treating the hall like musical chairs. The truth probably depended on the host's power and how much wine was flowing. So what was it like once everyone was in their place? Loud, really loud. Picture a football stadium at halftime, people shouting across the hall, musicians pounding drums, jesters cracking jokes, dogs barking at scraps under the tables. Guests weren't politely nodding, they were calling for more wine, bellowing songs, and sometimes arguing loud enough to drown out the minstrels. First joke: if you think your office's seating chart causes drama, try explaining to a 14th century baron why he's been moved to benches away from the gravy boat. Second joke: nobles were basically living Yelp reviews, loudly critiquing the food, except instead of stars, they shouted. Third joke: if you've ever tried to talk at a noisy restaurant, imagine multiplying that by 100 people yelling over the sound of hurdy-gurdy music. It wasn't all chaos, though. There was strategy. Where you sat determined who you could talk to, who you could impress, and who you might insult by ignoring. A banquet was networking, medieval style. Instead of LinkedIn, you had who sat next to the Duke during the venison course. One conversation in the right spot could change fortunes. One misstep, like spilling wine on your neighbor's robe, could start a feud. The punchline: banquets weren't solemn, whispering affairs. They were roaring, buzzing, feasting halls, where seating mattered more than manners, and where the noise level could make your modern family holiday dinner sound like a meditation retreat. Nobles weren't sitting silently in awe, they were competing, networking, and sometimes flat-out shouting across the roast swan. And you'll want to remember this rowdy energy, because in the next section, we're diving straight into how medieval nobles drank. Spoiler: if you thought the noise was bad sober, wait until the wine kegs roll in. The myth says medieval nobles, drank politely, raising tiny goblets of wine for a toast, sipping slowly, and always keeping their dignity intact. Maybe you imagine the king lifting his cup, the crowd falling silent, and everyone taking a neat little sip before setting their cups down with perfect precision. It sounds civilized, almost like a wine-tasting event at a modern vineyard. But flip that polite picture, and the truth pours out like a barrel tipped too far. Drinking wasn't dainty, was excessive, competitive, and sometimes downright reckless. Forget small goblets. Think massive flagons, overflowing pitchers, and servants rushing back and forth with more refills than your local bar on dollar beer night. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, records from across Europe describe nobles drinking heavily during banquets, with toasts, challenges, and drinking games forming part of the entertainment. In fact, wine wasn't always enough ale, mead, and even spiced. Concoctions were passed around, sometimes all at once. The result, a hall that grew louder, sloppier, and rowdier with each course. Quirky tidbit. There's a tale from 15th century England of a duke who challenged his rival to outdrink him, only to collapse under the table, while the other smugly demanded another jug. Imagine trying to win a political alliance by proving your liver was stronger. Medieval diplomacy, everybody. And the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the reputation of medieval drunkenness was exaggerated by moralizing clerics. Some say nobles truly drank themselves silly, while others suggest the accounts were exaggerated warnings, like don't end up like those sinful lords. Either way, enough first-hand descriptions survive to prove at least some feasts ended with nobles under the benches. Now, picture it, the hall already loud with chatter, and then the wine starts flowing faster. Voices rise, jokes get bawdier, and songs erupt, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in what can only be described as a medieval version of karaoke. By the third jug, no one cares if the song rhymes. First joke. Remember how your aunt insists she can hold her wine at family dinners. Medieval nobles were basically her, multiplied by 50, but with more fur robes and fewer casseroles. Second joke. Think about that moment when someone spills a drink on the carpet. Now replace carpet with rushes on the floor, and accept that wine-soaked straw was just part of the decor. Third joke. The noble who bragged about his self-control probably ended up talking to the roast swan by dessert. There was also a ritual element to drinking. Toasts weren't just casual, they were formal, often binding. To refuse a toast could be seen as an insult, even a challenge, which meant sometimes nobles had to drink more than they wanted just to avoid political fallout. Think of it as peer pressure with medieval stakes: drink or risk offending the Duke of Burgundy. And then there were the health myths. Some believed strong drink balanced the humors, while others swore a morning ale cured headaches caused by last night's ale. Spoiler, it didn't. Historians today still laugh about these medieval hangover cures, most of which involved drinking more. Classic. Here's the punchline. The idea that noble drinking was calm and controlled is about as accurate as calling a frat party a meditation retreat. Nobles weren't sipping wine, they were guzzling it, challenging each other, and sometimes collapsing under the very tables they were supposed to be ruling from. The banquet hall wasn't just a dining room, it was a brewery with chandeliers. And keep that thought bubbling, because in the next section, we'll see what kind of entertainment fueled all this chaos. Spoiler, it wasn't always the polite lute music you're picturing. It could get wild, unpredictable, and occasionally involve fire breathing. The myth paints medieval entertainment as refined solemn harp music in the background. Maybe a choir singing soft hymns, everyone clapping politely like they're at a royal opera. It's the picture you see in movies, nobles sipping wine while musicians strum gracefully, a quiet smile here, a gentle nod there. Entertainment, in this version, is elegant, subdued, and always dignified. But flip the stage, and you'll find the medieval banquet hall buzzing with spectacle that bordered on the absurd. Yes, musicians were there, but so were jesters juggling knives, acrobats tumbling across the rush-covered floor, trained animals performing tricks, and occasionally fire readers blasting flames into the smoky rafters. Forget background music. This was medieval dinner theater on steroids. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First chronicles describe entertainers ranging from minstrels and storytellers to jugglers and dancers. Nobles competed to hire the most extravagant acts, knowing that dazzling your guests with spectacle was as important as feeding them. Quirky tidbit. In Burgundy, one feast reportedly featured a dancing bear that waddled through the hall, wearing bells and stealing bits of bread from the tables. Imagine trying to focus on your venison while a bear jingles past your elbow. And the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how common the more outrageous stunts were. Were fire breathers and live animal shows staples of noble entertainment, or just the extreme cases chroniclers exaggerated? Some think the wilder acts were reserved for big occasions like coronations, while smaller feasts stuck to safer acts. The truth is blurry like your vision after 3 goblets of mead. Picture the scene, jesters cracking bawdy jokes that made half the table roar with laughter and the other half blush. Musicians switching from elegant tunes to fast, stomping dances that turned the hall into a medieval mosh pit. And nobles. They weren't above joining in. Some lords strutted, some ladies sang, and a few dared to juggle alongside the professionals, usually with disastrous, hilarious results. First joke. Imagine your boss trying to juggle apples at the company dinner and dropping one straight into the gravy boat. That's the noble vibe. Second joke. The medieval fire breather was basically the original birthday magician, only with a much higher chance of setting the tablecloth alight. Third joke. Trained monkeys sometimes joined the act, which means nobles risked being upstaged at dinner by a monkey with better table manners. And let's not forget tournaments staged as entertainment, too. Some feasts spilled outside into mock jousts, with knights crashing into each other while guests cheered. Talk about dinner and a show. The punchline. Medieval banquet entertainment wasn't polite background noise. It was noisy, unpredictable, and sometimes, laugh out loud, chaotic. If you thought your last dinner party was wild because someone sang karaoke off-key, imagine juggling dwarfs, fire-breathing stunts, and a bear stealing your bread. That's medieval refinement for you. And remember this carnival energy, because in the next section, we're about to stretch the timeline of these parties. Spoiler, banquets didn't always end after one night. They sometimes kept going long enough to make you wonder if anyone had a job besides eating and drinking. You probably assume medieval banquets were one-night affairs, a big dinner, a toast. Or, two, maybe some music. And then everyone stumbles home by midnight. After all, even the most indulgent modern wedding reception eventually ends when the lights come on and someone's uncle is still dancing badly to ABBA. But flip that neat image, and you discover medieval feasts sometimes lasted not just one night, but days, plural, as in, sorry, can't come to work this week. I'm still eating swan at the Duke's place. Imagine a dinner party so long you start wondering if you should pay rent for your seat at the table. Proof time. Mainstream. Fact. Major medieval celebrations, royal weddings, big religious festivals were known to last 3, 5, even 7 days. Records from King Richard II's coronation in 1377 describe endless courses spread out across multiple days, with musicians and entertainers rotating like a medieval music festival lineup. Quirky tidbit. One French feast reportedly featured such a non-stop schedule of food and drink that guests were given beds nearby so they could nap, wake up, and then shuffle back into the hall for round 2. Essentially, it was the world's first all-inclusive resort, minus the pool and scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these marathon feasts were truly as continuous as described, or whether chroniclers exaggerated. Did nobles really sit at tables for 5 days straight, or were there breaks where the servants quietly reset everything? Some think the descriptions were partly propagandic to show how generous and powerful a host was, even if reality was a little less glamorous. Still, the evidence is clear. Big banquets weren't a single evening, they were endurance events. Food kept arriving, wine kept flowing, and entertainment rolled on. Imagine pacing yourself through roast boar, sugared almonds, minstrels, and dancing, only to hear the steward announce, "Great news. We're only halfway through." First joke. If you've ever felt trapped at a long dinner party, just be glad you weren't stuck at a medieval 5-day feast where the only escape was pretending to faint. Second joke. Modern music festivals hand out wristbands. Medieval feasts handed out indigestion. Third joke. By day 3, the jesters were probably recycling their material hay. Remember the one about the peacock? But these long feasts weren't just indulgence for indulgence's sake. They were political theater. A lord who could feed and entertain people for days proved he had wealth, power, and connections. It was the medieval version of saying, "Look at me, I can afford bottomless brunch forever." The more days your feast lasted, the higher your prestige. Of course, the downside was exhaustion. Servants were worked to the bone, kitchens ran non-stop, and guests likely left feeling more sluggish than honored. Imagine trying to ride home after 5 days of constant eating and drinking. You'd need a nap before you even reached your horse. The punchline: medieval banquets weren't neat little dinners. They were marathons of food, drink, and spectacle. Party, half political statement, and entirely exhausting. So the next time you groan about a dinner running late, remember some nobles were stuck eating for days and still had to act like they were enjoying it. And tuck this image away, because in the next section, we'll peel back the glamour and look at the food itself. Spoiler: it wasn't always as fresh and delicious as it looked under the torchlight. You probably imagine medieval banquets serving food that was always fresh, pure, and fit for royalty. Giant roasted beasts pulled straight from the hunt, glistening fruits just plucked from the orchard, and delicate pastries baked that very morning. In the myth, nothing less than perfection touches a noble's plate. After all, these were the richest of the rich. Surely they didn't eat anything questionable, right? But flip that illusion, and you'll find something far less appetizing. Yes, there were fresh dishes, but behind the shimmering platters lurked meat past its prime, fish hauled in days too late, and creative kitchen tricks to make it all look and taste more appealing than it really was. In short, medieval nobles sometimes dined on meals that would get a modern restaurant shut down by health inspectors before the first course. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, medieval preservation methods were limited. Salt, smoking, pickling, or drying were the main options. If a banquet lasted several days, food wasn't always freshly prepared. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just status symbols. They often helped mask unpleasant flavors. Think of it as medieval feuds for venison, quirky tidbit. A 14th century recipe describes boiling a fish, then painting it with saffron and gold leaf to disguise the fact it was dried weeks before. Guests marveled at the golden sheen, never suspecting they were eating what we'd call rebranded leftovers. And the scholarly debate, historians still argue just how risky noble diets really were. Some claim nobles had the best access to fresh game and produce, while others point out that the obsession with heavy spices suggests food quality wasn't always great. Was the spice craze about flavor or survival? The jury remains split. Now imagine the kitchen itself. Massive fireplaces roaring, dozens of servants hacking, boiling, basting, and desperately trying to keep questionable cuts of meat looking glamorous enough for the high table. The smell must have been overwhelming. Part delicious roast, part is that supposed to smell like that? And nobles, they weren't sniffing suspiciously. They were dazzled by spectacle, distracted by gold-leafed swans and sugar sculptures. First joke. Picture Gordon Ramsay storming into a medieval kitchen. It's rotten. It's covered in saffron, and it's still rotten. Second joke. Nobles probably thought their exotic spices made them classy, but really, they were just seasoning over yesterday's mistakes. Third joke. You know that friend who insists leftovers taste better the next day? Medieval cooks would have called that fine dining. And yet, despite the risks, banquets rarely stopped serving questionable dishes. Why? Because the goal wasn't health, it was show. Nobles needed their food to look rich, exotic, and overwhelming. Whether or not it was truly fresh mattered less than whether it impressed the room. The punchline. Medieval feasts weren't flawless gourmet spreads. They were a mix of fresh game, spiced disguises, and risky experiments that sometimes pushed food safety to the edge. Nobles weren't immune to bad meals. They just had fancier ways to cover them up. So next time you complain about fast food being sketchy, remember, at least your burger doesn't come spray-painted with gold leaf to hide the smell. And keep that thought close, because in the next section, we'll see that these feasts weren't limited to nobles at all. Sometimes, the servants, musicians, and even ordinary townsfolk got in on the action, whether they were invited or not. The myth says medieval banquets were exclusive affairs, private tables reserved only for nobles, sealed off from ordinary people. You might picture velvet curtains keeping peasants outside, with only the elite allowed to taste the roast boar. And sugared almonds. It feels like the ultimate gated community of dining, rich people inside, everyone else shut out in the cold. But flip that image, and the truth is far more porous. Yes, nobles were the stars of the show, but the banquets spilled over into a buzzing crowd of servants, musicians, performers, and even ordinary townsfolk who sometimes found ways to share in the feast. A banquet wasn't a private dinner, it was a public performance. Proof time. Mainstream fact first. Servants didn't just work the feast, they ate from it too. Once the upper tables were done, leftovers and trencher bread often went to the household staff or were given out at the gate to waiting townsfolk. This wasn't charity so much as spectacle. Nobles proved their wealth by letting others share the crumbs. Quirky tidbit. There's a famous account of a feast in London where the crowd outside grew so large and unruly that guards had to physically push them back, only for the townsfolk to snatch food straight from servants' trays as they passed. Imagine trying to deliver a golden pie to the high table while peasants treat you like a medieval Uber Eats, and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this generosity was genuine or just strategic. PR was giving food to the poor truly about kindness, or was it nobles flexing their wealth in front of an audience? Some suggest the banquet leftovers were meant less to feed the needy and more to remind them who held the purse strings. Inside the hall, the non-noble presence was impossible to ignore. Musicians filled the air with constant sound, jesters cracked jokes at nobles' expense, acrobats flipped between benches, and servants rushed endlessly with platters. The noble diners may have been the focus, but the feast couldn't exist without a buzzing swarm of others weaving through the spectacle. First joke. If you've ever tried to eat in peace with your kids hovering over your fries, that's basically how nobles felt with servants, minstrels, and townsfolk eyeing their plates. Second joke. Nobles might have strutted around like the stars, but honestly, the musicians were the ones setting the vibe. They were medieval DJs with lutes. Third joke. Handing leftovers to the poor sounds generous, but really, it was like posting your wealth on Instagram. Look how rich I am. I give away soggy bread. This mix of classes also meant the feast doubled as a stage for social theater. Servants and townsfolk got to see the power and luxury of the nobles up close, while nobles got to show off their wealth and connections. It was part dinner, part political rally, part circus. And here's the punchline. Medieval feasts weren't closed doors of exclusivity. They were noisy, crowded spectacles that involved far more than just nobles. The food, music, and chaos spilled outward, drawing in everyone from jesters to hungry neighbors. So the next time you imagine nobles dining in isolation, remember, they were basically throwing parties with an audience, whether they wanted one or not. And keep that audience in mind, because in the next section, we'll dive into how noble women fit into these chaotic halls. Spoiler, they weren't just sitting silently, they laughed, drank, and sometimes schemed louder than anyone else. The myth says medieval noblewomen at banquets were quiet, modest, and demure like delicate ornaments placed at the table, speaking only when spoken to, nibbling tiny bites of bread, and never raising their voices. In this picture, they're more decoration than participant. They're only to look graceful, while the men roar with laughter and drain the wine. But flip that polite fantasy, and the truth is far livelier. Noblewomen weren't just silent bystanders. They laughed, drank, danced, and sometimes schemed with as much energy or more than the men. These banquets were as much their stage as anyone else's, and some women used the chaos to build alliances, spread gossip, and even show off their wit in front of the whole hall. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, chronicles and letters describe noble women drinking, joking, and even leading dances at the feast of Philip the Good in Burgundy. Ladies were praised for their merry voices echoing across the hall, not for sitting silently. Their presence added glamour and energy, and their behavior was often as bold as the men's. There's a story of a noble woman in France who outdrank several men at a wedding feast and proudly announced herself the queen of the table. Imagine the shock of her rivals, forced to toast her victory while trying not to slide under the bench, and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much freedom noble women really had at these events. Some accounts highlight their boldness, joking, dancing, even flirting, while others suggest chroniclers exaggerated to criticize improper behavior. Were these women breaking norms, or simply enjoying privileges men later pretended didn't exist? The debate continues. Picture it, a hall already loud with music and wine, and noble women joining in the chorus, clinking goblets, laughing at jesters, and sometimes making jokes sharper than the men's, far from shrinking into the background. Many used these feasts to show off charm, intelligence, and influence. Whispered gossip over trenchers of meat could shift alliances as much as a toast shouted across the table. First joke. If you've ever seen someone dominate karaoke night, imagine a duchess belting out a ballad while the duke snores in his goblet. Second joke. The so-called modest noblewoman myth falls apart the moment you picture a lady balancing a jug of wine on her head as part of a drinking game. Third joke. Servants must have rolled their eyes constantly. Great. Now the ladies are throwing bread at each other, too. And don't forget, noble women weren't only participants, they were also symbols. Their laughter and presence displayed their family's wealth and connections. Hosting a banquet where women felt free to shine reflected well on the household. Far from being ornaments, they were part of the power play woven into every feast. The punchline. Noble women at banquets weren't silent wallflowers. They drank, joked, schemed, and sometimes stole the show. So, the next time you picture a noble woman delicately sipping water in silence, remember she might have been raising her goblet higher than anyone else and daring the men to keep up and hold on to that image, because in the next section we'll see how religion tried to keep feasts holy and how quickly piety collapsed once the wine and swan arrived. The myth goes like this. Medieval banquets were proof of Christian piety. Nobles supposedly began meals with long prayers, spoke in hushed reverence, and treated the entire event like a holy extension of the church. In this version, the feast is practically a sermon with extra bread rolls, where everyone is devout and dignified until the very last bite. But flip that tidy picture, and you'll see a hilariously messy contradiction. Yes, prayers were said and blessings offered, but within minutes, grace collided with gluttony. The same voices that solemnly intoned the Lord's Prayer often shouted bawdy jokes half an hour later. Banquets were arenas where religion and revelry wrestled, with piety often losing the match to roasted boar and overflowing wine. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, it's true that feasts began with blessings, and religious figures were sometimes present. clergy might even sit at the high table, reinforcing the idea that this meal was sanctioned by God. But after the blessing, the atmosphere shifted fast. Quirky tidbit. At one infamous feast, a monk was asked to bless the matonly, to be drowned out by minstrels who started drumming mid-prayer. The poor man's words disappeared under the sound of tambourines and laughter. Talk about holy interruptions. And the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how seriously nobles took these religious gestures. Some insist the prayers were genuine acts of devotion, while others suggest they were ceremonial tokens, like checking a box before diving into excess. Was piety the heart of the feast, or just the polite appetizer before the real fun? The arguments keep bubbling. Now, imagine it, the bishop at the high table, nodding solemnly as the prayer ends, only to have a jester leap up minutes later and start mocking priests for drinking too much ale. Laughter erupts, goblets clash, and the bishop probably pretends not to hear. The contradiction was baked into the culture. Honor God, then honor your stomach. First joke: if you've ever promised to start a diet tomorrow while reaching for dessert, that's basically the medieval approach to piety at banquets. Second joke: priests might have preached moderation on Sunday, but come feast night, some were raising goblets right alongside the Lord's. Third joke: imagine saying amen and immediately chasing it with a 3-day binge. And don't think nobles didn't notice the irony. Some deliberately flaunted their excess, daring critics to call them out. A noble might donate leftover trenchers to the poor, an act of charity, while still bragging about how many barrels of wine he finished. It was part devotion, part showmanship, part hypocrisy. The punchline: banquets didn't prove unwavering piety, they highlighted the messy balance between faith and indulgence. Nobles wanted to appear devout, but they also wanted to eat, drink, and laugh until dawn. The result was a strange blend, prayers floating upward while roast geese and goblets clattered below. And keep this contradiction in mind, because in the next section, we'll see how the night usually ended, not in solemn prayer, but in chaos that looked suspiciously like a medieval frat party gone wrong. The myth says that everyone left a medieval banquet sober and civil, walking gracefully out of the hall, bowing politely, and heading home like gentlemen and ladies who'd just attended a royal tea party. In your imagination, the feast ends. Neatly, the king dismisses the crowd, musicians play a soft tune, and nobles float out as if they're characters in a bedtime fairy tale. But flip that fantasy, and you'll see exits that looked more like the aftermath of a college frat party than a royal gathering. Guests stumbling, some passed out under the tables, others bickering or singing off-key as servants tried to herd them toward the doors. The end of a banquet wasn't a tidy procession. It was glorious, wine-soaked chaos. Proof time. Mainstream fact. First, accounts describe nobles drinking heavily, and by the time the feast wound down, many were openly drunk. Chroniclers mentioned lords carried home on the backs of servants or left behind in a heap to be dealt with later. Banquets didn't fade quietly, they crashed to a close. Quirky tidbit. In one 15th century German banquet, a noble was so drunk he mistook a pig tied up for slaughter as his horse and tried to ride it home. Spoiler: the pig did not cooperate, and the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether drunkenness was universal or exaggerated by moralizing writers. Some believe most nobles knew how to pace themselves, while others point to mountains of records about goblets refilled nonstop. Was it every feast, or just the ones that made the best gossip? The truth likely sat somewhere between. Now picture the hall at midnight, spilled wine soaking into the rushes, trenchers half-eaten and tossed to the dogs, musicians playing louder to cover the drunken shouting. A duke snores with his head on the table. A lady laughs too loudly as she tries to balance on a bench. Two cousins argue about who sat closer to the salt, while a servant desperately tries to stop them from throwing bones across the room. This wasn't a polite farewell, it was medieval closing time. First joke. Imagine the poor servants dragging half-conscious nobles toward their carriages, muttering, "Next time, I'm taking a job in the monastery kitchen." Second joke. If you've ever seen someone hug a lamppost after too much beer, picture a noble clinging to a candelabrum in full velvet robes. Third joke. Nobles claimed to be models of dignity, yet half the time, dignity was the first thing they lost. And sometimes, the chaos spilled into fights, feuds that simmered during the feast over seating, toasts, or even jokes, sometimes exploded once the wine hit too hard. Punches were thrown, swords sometimes drawn, and feasts that began with prayers ended with shouting matches that echoed down the streets. The punchline. Medieval banquets didn't end with quiet bows and orderly exits. They ended like a medieval rave, messy, noisy, and often requiring servants to clean up both the hall and the guests. Nobles might have strutted in with dignity, but many rolled out with headaches, bruises, and wine stains that even saffron couldn't cover. And keep that picture in mind, because in the next section, we'll peel back the real purpose of these feasts. Spoiler: it wasn't just about eating or drinking, it was about power plays and political theater dressed up as dinner. The myth says medieval banquets were only about food, grand meals where nobles gathered simply to indulge in endless meat, pies, and puddings. It's easy to picture them as luxurious dinners, nothing more than a chance to gorge on delicacies with friends, free from the stress of politics or war. But flip that feast day fantasy and you uncover the real function. Banquets were weapons. These gatherings weren't just about feeding bellies. They were about feeding reputations, forging alliances, humiliating rivals, and sending political messages. Every roasted swan, every jug of wine, every seat at the table was part of a strategy. Proof time. Mainstream fact first. Historians widely agree that feasts served as demonstrations of wealth and power. By hosting extravagant banquets, nobles displayed resources, cemented loyalties, and reminded everyone of their dominance. A dinner could be as powerful as a battle when it came to shaping reputations. Quirky tidbit. At a 15th century French feast, the host deliberately served his guests small portions of plain food just to contrast it with his own table, which was piled high with exotic dishes. Subtle? No. Effective? Absolutely. Nothing rubs in superiority like eating a golden goose while your rival chews stale bread. And the scholarly debate. Some historians argue whether these feasts were primarily genuine celebrations or carefully orchestrated performances. Were nobles sincerely trying to honor guests, or were they manipulating the stage to remind everyone who held the purse strings? The truth likely blended both motives, depending on the host's ambitions. Picture the hall again, nobles laughing, drinking, clapping along to music, but underneath it all, they're watching who sits where, who speaks with whom, and who looks left out. A toast isn't just a toast, it's a signal. A seat at the high table isn't just convenient, it's a message. Even the leftovers tossed to townsfolk outside reinforced the host's image as generous ruler, while also saying, "Look how much I can afford to waste." First joke. Imagine a CEO inviting rivals to a dinner, then handing them Happy Meals while eating lobster himself. That's basically the medieval playbook. Second joke. Nobles weren't just trying to outfeed each other, they were trying to outflex. "Oh, you served peacock. Cute. I dyed mine blue and made it breathe fire." Third joke. Medieval banquets were less family dinner and more political PowerPoint presentation, only with gravy stains. And this theater wasn't always subtle. At times, nobles used banquets to seal alliances, announce marriages, or even declare wars. Guests might leave with full stomachs, but they also left with marching orders or grudges. A badly handled feast could be just as dangerous as a battlefield blunder. The punchline: banquets weren't innocent dinners. They were chess games played with roasted swans and spiced wine, where every gesture could shift loyalties and shape futures. So the next time you imagine nobles gathering just to feast, remember, they were playing politics with trenchers and goblets, one bite at a time. And keep that political lens polished, because in the next section, we'll see how these supposedly purely European feasts weren't so isolated after all. Spoiler: exotic spices, foreign dancers, and cultural mashups broke the myth wide open. The myth says medieval banquets were proudly insular, purely European affairs, where nobles dined on their own traditional foods, wore only local fashions, and kept their entertainment strictly homegrown. You might picture a hall filled with nothing but roast beef, bread, and ale, while everyone clings to their national customs with stubborn pride. In this myth, nobles never mixed cultures, but flip that narrative, and you find something far more colorful. Medieval feasts were cultural mashups, layered with exotic spices, imported fashions, and performers drawn from distant lands. Far from isolating themselves, nobles loved flaunting foreign influences as proof of wealth, sophistication, and connections. A feast wasn't just dinner, it was a global showroom. The myth in detail: you've been told to imagine nobles eating only the staples of their countryside: venison hunted nearby, bread baked in the village oven, ale brewed down the road. The clothes are heavy local wool, the music rustic, the recipes passed down for generations. It's a picture of medieval purity, like a Renaissance fair without the turkey legs. Everything about the banquet is assumed to be inward-looking, proudly regional, even nationalistic. The truth in vivid color: in reality, medieval upper-class banquets were shockingly cosmopolitan. By the 13th and 14th centuries, spices like cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, saffron, and black pepper were traveling thousands of miles through trade networks that stretched from the Middle East to India and beyond. Nobles didn't just want meat and bread, they wanted dishes flavored with ingredients most of their peasants had never even smelled. To sprinkle pepper on your venison was to announce, "I can afford something that came halfway around the world." And it wasn't just spices. Sugar, imported in expensive blocks, sweetened elaborate desserts. Almonds from Spain, figs from the Levant, and rice from Asia found their way into puddings and pies. Imagine sitting down at a local medieval feast and being served a saffron-dyed chicken stuffed with almonds and raisins. That's less farmhouse dinner and more global fusion cuisine. Proof time, mainstream fact. Banquet menus from the courts of France and England list dishes flavored with cinnamon, ginger, and clove spices, transported at enormous cost from Asia through Venetian merchants. These weren't side notes, they were central to the prestige of the meal. Quirky tidbit: at one 14th century banquet in France, entertainers included Moorish dancers, brought specifically to shock and dazzle the crowd with their foreign style. Imagine the murmurs across the hall, half awe, half gossip, all spectacle. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the craze for foreign foods and fashions reflected genuine appreciation for other cultures, or whether it was shallow posturing. Were nobles truly curious about the wider world, or were they just flexing their ability to buy expensive imports? Some argue it was both a blend of fascination and showmanship. The banquet scene: nobles in fur-rimmed robes sip sweetened wine, flavored with imported sugar and cinnamon. A dish arrives, fish molded into the shape of a dragon, dyed with saffron to shimmer gold. On the side, a rice pudding glistens with raisins that traveled farther than most guests ever would. Musicians strike up a tune, lutes playing alongside, foreign drums, and suddenly dancers whirl into the hall, their costumes flashing with styles unfamiliar to European eyes. It wasn't just about taste, it was about bragging rights. To serve plain venison might keep bellies full, but to serve venison glazed with imported spices made a statement. My trade connections are stronger, my coffers deeper, my hall more impressive than yours. Nobles were competing on an international stage, even when seated in their own castles. The humor: 3 jokes. First joke: imagine a medieval noble bragging about his saffron, like a modern influencer flaunting his new iPhone. Oh, this old thing came all the way from Asia, darling. Second joke: peasants outside the castle probably whispered, "What's saffron taste like?" only to have a servant shrug and reply, "Like money." Third joke: nobles sprinkled pepper so generously it was practically medieval hot sauce, except instead of costing $3 a bottle, it was worth its weight in silver. Cultural mashup in fashion and entertainment. And it wasn't just food. Banquets became fashion runways, where nobles showed off imported silks from Italy, embroidered velvets from Flanders, and jewelry inspired by Byzantine designs. One chronicler mocked nobles for dressing in outlandish foreign garb, but secretly admitted it looked dazzling under the candlelight. Entertainment, too, leaned global. Alongside jesters and acrobats, you might see imported instruments, like the oud ancestor of the lute or witness, jugglers using techniques learned along trade routes. The banquet hall became a miniature world fair, cramming distant cultures into one noisy, smoky, wine-soaked evening. Why the obsession with foreign influences? Because banquets weren't just meals, they were stages of power. By importing spices, fashions, and performers, nobles signaled their wealth, their trade connections, and their ability to command the exotic. It was less about genuine appreciation for other cultures, and more about turning culture into currency. And yet, the result was undeniable. Medieval banquets weren't isolated bubbles of pure Europe. They were crossroads where East met West, where cinnamon from Ceylon ended up in English pudding, and where Moorish dances lit up halls in Burgundy. The myth of insular medieval feasts collapses once you realize nobles were basically cultural magpies, plucking shiny bits from everywhere and weaving them into their banquets. They weren't proudly rejecting foreign influence, they were flaunting it like trophies. So the next time someone tells you medieval Europe was closed off and isolated, remind them of the noble who dyed his chicken blue, stuffed it with almonds, and bragged about his cinnamon stash louder than a modern coffee snob. And keep this colorful image in mind, because in the next section, we'll see that beneath all the glamour and glitter, these banquets didn't always end happily. Rivalries simmered, scandals broke, and sometimes the seeds of downfall were planted right there at the table. The myth says medieval banquets always ended happily, full stomachs, satisfied guests, and glowing memories of good food, good company, and good music. You might imagine nobles strolling out arm in arm, chuckling softly, friendships strengthened, and everyone falling asleep on silk pillows with nothing but sweet dreams. In this myth, banquets are flawless celebrations, remembered fondly and free of consequences. But flip that tidy story, and the truth is sharper. Behind the laughter and spectacle, feasts often planted seeds of rivalry, scandal, and downfall. What looked like merriment on the surface could hide whispers of betrayal, heated arguments, or moments of humiliation that haunted nobles for years. Banquets weren't always safe. They were tinderboxes where too much wine, too much pride, and too many fragile egos sometimes caught fire. The happy ending myth: imagine the textbook version. Torches fade, minstrels play a lullaby, and nobles thank their hosts with perfect bows. It's the medieval equivalent of a movie fade-out cue, happy music, roll credits. In this version, feasts were remembered as unblemished highlights, markers of prestige with no messy aftermath. The truth in motion reality was messier. Yes, some feasts ended well, but many ended with rivalries deepened, scandals whispered, or outright violence erupting. Banquets were stages for ego, and egos clashed. That duke you toasted at the high table, he might be plotting against you tomorrow. That lady who laughed too loudly at your joke, her husband might see it as an insult. Feasts looked like joy, but they often carried political fallout, sharper than any sword. Proof time mainstream fact. Chronicles record multiple feasts ending in fights. At one English banquet, guests argued over precedence at the high table. An argument so heated it carried into the courtyard with swords drawn. The feast was remembered less for the venison than for the blood spilled outside. Quirky tidbit: in Burgundy, a nobleman once made the mistake of insulting another's fashion at a banquet. The next day, the two met in a duel, sparked not by politics or land, but by a sarcastic jab about velvet sleeves. Imagine losing your life over a roast and a roast joke. Scholarly debate: historians argue how dangerous banquets truly were. Some see them as carefully controlled spectacles where disputes were rare. Others highlight the abundance of records of brawls, duels, and humiliations. Were these exceptions, or the unspoken norm? The debate simmers like a pot about to boil over the banquet scene. Picture the feast winding down. Torches flicker low, the music softens, and servants clear trenchers. Outwardly, it looks peaceful, but under the surface, the air is thick with unspoken tensions. Who sat closer to the host? Who drank too much and embarrassed themselves? Who flirted too openly? Who spoke too loudly? Who laughed at the wrong person's joke? These moments stuck. Nobles obsessed over reputation, and a single slight at a feast could echo for years. A spilled goblet could be taken as a deliberate insult. A missed toast could be remembered as betrayal. Banquets didn't always end at dawn. They lingered in memory, fueling grudges and reshaping alliances. 3 jokes, because even scandal has humor. First joke: if you think office holiday parties are risky, remember that at least your coworkers' karaoke won't start a duel at sunrise. Second joke: nobles loved to brag about lasting alliances formed at feasts, but sometimes those alliances lasted shorter than the pie. Third joke: picture a noble waking up hungover, groaning, "Did I really challenge the bishop to arm wrestle over dessert?" The seeds of downfall, and sometimes the consequences, went beyond personal grudges. Entire dynastic shifts began at banquets. A king showing favoritism at the high table could spark rebellion among overlooked nobles. A lavish feast could drain a treasury, leaving a kingdom financially weaker. Too much spectacle, too much ambition, and suddenly the banquet became a symbol of decline. Take the example of Charles VI of France. At a masquerade Baltern feast, dancers and costumes caught fire, leading to chaos and death. What began as a show of joy became a tragedy remembered for generations. Banquets were glamorous, but they were also risky theaters of human folly. Punchline: so no, not every medieval feast ended happily. Many ended with headaches, bruised egos, scandals, or even blood. Behind the glittering food and music lurked tensions that could outlast the echoes of the hall. The myth of cheerful endings crumbles when you realize some nobles left banquets not with sweet memories, but with grudges sharp enough to shape history. And now, since we've feasted through 15 sections of myths, truths, and messy realities, it's time to let the torches dim and the noise fade. The feast grows quiet now. The torches, once blazing, burn low, their flames curling into sleepy embers. The echoes of laughter and clanging goblets fade into the distance, leaving behind only a hum of memory, like music you still hear after the band has stopped playing. You're still there, sitting at the long table, but now the rushes on the floor have settled, and the hall no longer roars with noise. You can almost hear the gentle crackle of the fire, soft and steady, like a heartbeat calming after a long race. The smells of roasted meats and spiced wine linger faintly, but they're fading too, becoming nothing more than traces in the cool night air. As your eyes grow heavier, the hall feels less like a place of chaos and more like a dream. The banners, draped along the stone walls, flutter softly in the draft. The goblets are empty, the trenchers cleared, the minstrels long gone. What's left is stillness, a kind of peace that was hidden under the noise, waiting to reveal itself only now. You can imagine the nobles sleeping in their chambers, the servants finally resting, the dogs curled beneath the tables. The feast is over. The rivalries, the laughter, the arguments, they can wait for another day. Tonight, only silence remains. So let yourself settle into that silence. Feel the weight of the hall lifting away from your shoulders, replaced by the gentlest of calm. The torches dim further, the fire softens to a glow, and the world becomes quieter with every breath you take. Close your eyes and let the echoes of the banquet fade into dreams.